what became abundantly clear through listening to other interviews of people who experienced the chronic dizziness and also just generally speaking chronic pain was understanding the kind of character traits of people who experience these symptoms for the most part. So for me, conscientiousness, overly conscientious, people pleaser, anxious, these kind of things really kind of consume my life, especially when I was younger.
Welcome to The Story Behind the Symptoms, a podcast from Symptomatic.me. Your host is David Clark, MD, a board-certified gastroenterologist who successfully diagnosed and treated over 7,000 patients with neuroplastic pain or illness. Each episode, we dive into our guests' life experiences to uncover the deeper causes of their symptoms. By listening to their story, you will gain insights that advance your own journey towards knowledge that becomes healing.
Welcome to the Story Behind the Symptoms podcast. I am your host, Dr. David Clark, president of the Association for the Treatment of Neuroplastic Symptoms. And on this podcast, we talk to people about those symptoms and where they might have come from. My guest today is Alex. And Alex, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Clark, for having me on the show. As he mentioned, my name is Alex BH. I am a pianist and composer based in Los Angeles. Currently in New York recording, just happen to be traveling. And my experience with mind-body symptoms has lasted, it's been 3.5 years since my symptoms started. And I'm at a place now where I feel comfortable sharing kind of where I'm at in the process and how I've managed to take my life from what was then miserable. And like many of you, I'm sure, who are listening, who have experienced the symptoms yourselves, it feels like it can completely consume your life, into now where, although I manage it on a regular basis, my life is full again and back to levels that I had hoped it would when I was not doing well.
All right, let's talk about what those symptoms are and how they got started and their progress over time.
So yeah, my initial diagnosis was MDDS. I was on a boat trip in the Amalfi Coast, and actually going back a little bit, it was in Europe. I had just finished 2 months of touring as a musician, and I was in Europe with my now wife, then just girlfriend, and we were going to south of France, and we were in Nice and walking on the boardwalk, and all of a sudden I just hear a pop in my ear, and it feels like a balloon just gradually sort of increases and increases in size. And I end up going to the urgent care. I speak French well, but again, there might have been some loss in translation there, but they sort of treat it as potentially like a bacterial or a viral infection. So they give me antibiotics and they also give me a steroid, trying to treat it from both ends. But it was bizarre because the onset just didn't really make any sense. I had been stressed and traveling a lot, but if you look at it from the modern medical side, there wouldn't be necessarily a reason that it would have happened per se. So fast forward a few days, we are in the Amalfi Coast, and my wife and I go on a boat ride, and unbelievably choppy. Just, I know that in that moment, I sort of fluctuated between trying to keep it cool. I've always been sensitive to motion. And so this boat ride, I just felt, it was just up and down, up and down. We go to Positano, spend the day, take the boat back. And that night I'm lying in bed, and then it starts to feel as though I'm moving up 5 to 10 feet in the air. And it was truly bizarre. The next day we're walking around Pompeii, and the symptoms abate as I'm walking. So I don't feel the sensation of up and down motion. It's mainly just as I'm still that then I start to feel this constant waves of motion. The next day, we fly back to the United States, and when we land in Dallas, I stand up, start to walk off the plane, and my world just completely turns. And the only time I ever felt this true sensation of vertigo, where the room is spinning, the floor is moving up and down. I start to dry heave. I go to the bathroom and I'm just like, I can't vomit, but it feels like I'm going to. It was just pure chaos inside of my body. And I don't know what's going on. To sort of move through this experience at a rate that I think I can get through it all, I start seeing doctors. The next day I go to the hospital and they tell me that it's BPPV. And so I think it's potentially treatable doing the Epley maneuver. So I go to a chiropractor who tries to perform the Epley on me, and it makes my symptoms worse. I then go to an ENT, and he doesn't know what's wrong with me. So then I go to a neurologist, and the neurologist diagnoses me with MDDS, which throughout the 2 or 3 weeks prior to this diagnosis, I had kind of put together that that's what it might be called. But again, the diagnosis is bleak, especially according to the websites. If your symptoms don't abate after a year, that it's likely something you'll just deal with for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and we don't need to necessarily get into the details of what these acronyms stand for, but there are basically different kinds of inner ear vertigo type conditions.
Yes, exactly. So yes, MDDS, Maladie-Bark-Mall syndrome. Some people might be called PPPD as well. Those diagnoses are kind of in similar brackets of symptomatic diagnoses related to dizziness. So the process of taking that in and sort of understanding what this might be, it starts a chain reaction of me just being determined to try to figure out what's wrong with me. And it becomes my life. I lose tons of work as a musician. You know, I was a touring musician and doing a lot of that stuff, all of it out the window. It completely consumes my life. And as many people can relate to the experience of trying to be an A student when it comes to your recovery, that level of dedication when it comes to treating yourself in a mind-body context doesn't work. And I shouldn't be surprised that trying all of these expensive modalities that I end up doing, like I went to Mount Sinai to do the VOR kind of training exercises there. I went to Minnesota to see Dr. Cha out there and try to understand this better. I do Botox injections. I do, you name it. I did pretty much everything that I possibly could to try to fix the issue. And nothing, I would say the only thing that kind of marginally worked was the VOR exercises, but I relapsed several months after to the point that I was before. And so I almost don't count it because I think that I had mentally told myself that this was going to help, and it didn't.
And did anyone anywhere along the way suggest the possibility that this could be a mind-to-body condition, a neuroplastic condition? I mean, you're seeing a lot of experts here. And
No.
we know that from research of numerous studies, dozens of studies, about 40% of people who visit a primary care physician for a symptom, that it's mind-to-body. So that it should be in the mix of possibilities that are considered for anybody who doesn't have an obvious structural abnormality or organ disease. Did anybody point you in that direction?
No, definitely not. The only person that I ever talked to throughout this whole year and a half of trying to fix the problem and not working was my neurologist. I saw a different neurologist in LA who actually also was diagnosed with MDDS and went through slightly less prolonged but still severe version of what I had gone through. Her treatment was using the modern medical system of doing vestibular therapy, and her life I perceived as being quite limited. And, she would restrict herself from going into stores and going into anywhere with fluorescent lights, those kinds of things, which were major triggers for me as well. So I, at the time, could totally empathize. And I do empathize with it. Of course, I want her to live her best life as she sees fit. But it seemed, even at the time, maybe subconsciously limiting, that I would have to put all these restrictions on my life and monitor all my decisions as to where I went, the things that I did, how I engaged in the physical world. And it wasn't really until November 23 when I had just relapsed from, the symptoms had come rushing back. Again, sort of no reason. I was at Thanksgiving dinner with my grandmother and I was walking and then just felt like I fell through the floor. And this sensation of trampoline floor, which has lasted and I would say is the prevailing symptom that I experience on a day-to-day basis, that just completely magnified and really took me back to a dark place, feeling as though I had exhausted all of my options. In November, just a few days later, I had saved months before. I had saved an interview of the Steady Coach podcast, and I had listened to an interview with Dr. Yo and one of her success story clients, Joella, who's now also a coach treating people for dizziness. And I listened to her interview and I felt so seen and understood because Joella was also given the MDDS diagnosis, and the stories that we had ourselves were just kind of parallel in terms of not exact parallel of upbringing and personality traits and trauma per se. Again, for me, I would say lowercase t. For my ancestors, uppercase T trauma, and we'll get into that. But I felt so understood. And when we reached the end of this podcast where they start talking about the modalities that got her to a place that would make her life better, it was all about EMDR, IFS, therapy, psychological intervention rather than physical modalities.
Yeah, the EMDR and IFS are forms of psychotherapy. Yeah, this is extremely important. The turning point that people experience is very instructive for others who are searching for answers. And Dr. Arthur's podcast is outstanding. You can find it online under the Steady Coach. The resonated for you in watching that. Can you share that with us?
I think what resonated with me at first was just the notion that the fear of the symptoms themselves is what perpetuates it. And not that simply, but that was one idea that I remember really striking me initially. And it's more complicated than that. Of course, there's, emotional aspects of it too. But I think once I had heard this interview, I start to read, Healing Back Pain, Dr. Arno. I start reading The Way Out, Alan Gordon, and these kinds of books and this literature just hammers home this point that the focus is on understanding what's within and not what's going on the outside. So anytime that you experience symptom increase, instead of just focusing on, I went on a run and my symptoms increased, therefore I shouldn't run. That's not necessarily the point. The point is accepting the symptoms as they are, even though, and I know firsthand for those of you out there who are dealing with it or who have dealt with it, that it's so difficult to separate your emotions from the sensations themselves. It's really hard to unwind this notion that something is deeply wrong with you, because when these symptoms last and become chronic, you start to second guess and understand that this is maybe a life sentence, and also that something is damaged. And really at its core, there's no structural damage. There's nothing wrong with you when you have mind-body symptoms, but it can feel so consuming because the symptoms can be just constant 24/7, either pain or discomfort.
Yeah, it's difficult to believe that these symptoms are not the result of bodily damage or organ disease. They are absolutely real symptoms. They are physical symptoms. And certainly part of my training as a physician that you search for the organ disease or structural damage in somebody who's got physical symptoms like this. So shifting your attention, trying to understand what your mind might be trying to tell you, that these symptoms are an expression of distress, and trying to figure out what the distress might be. Were you able to make some progress along those lines? Once you shifted from fear about lifelong physical disability from this, what kinds of insights came up?
Well, I think what became abundantly clear through listening to other interviews of people who experienced the chronic dizziness and also just generally speaking chronic pain was understanding the kind of character traits of people who experience these symptoms for the most part. So for me, things that I exhibit that I saw in books like The Way Out and just other literature that I started to read was conscientiousness, overly conscientious, people pleaser, anxious. These kind of things really kind of consume my life, especially when I was younger. I don't think that I felt at that time that I was as deeply anxious or that I was as much of a people pleaser as I was when I was young. But I felt as a kid, especially, very much conforming to meet other people's needs especially in a friend context. I felt like I was the kind of person that would try to bend myself to be as socially malleable as possible. And I realized that the core of it was that it was because I didn't love myself. And I had tendencies of self-loathing and self-hatred. Those words may sound too harsh, but along those lines of just having low self-esteem. And so as a person with low self-esteem, I felt a desire to surround myself with people who showed me love because I was incapable of doing it for myself at that time. And I think that, again, that was one particular trait that I think I saw very much in the literature as I started to read that this is something that I need to work on.
Yeah, these are deeply important insights that for many people are the key first step on their pathway toward healing. I want to ask you about a couple of other personality traits that are very common in my patients. You may not necessarily have had either of these, but I'll ask them anyway. And the first one is that many of my patients are the kinds of people that are so devoted to the needs of others in their world that they tend not to put themselves on the list of people they take care of. They tend not to take time for their own joy, to do things that are purely about having fun, to actually just to play. Was that a characteristic that you had?
I don't think that I exhibited that trait in the sense of being kind of a caretaker and trying to take care of other people before myself. I think I did a decent job of trying to indulge myself and engage in things that I enjoyed and not sacrifice that at my own expense to help other people. But I think the ways in which I do think that I was a social caretaker, in the sense, again, back to the point before, that I did exhibit qualities of trying to make other people feel special in a friend context, and that I tried to, again, collect friends almost and try to make myself as adaptable without being authentic to myself. So I think in that sense, I was, like I said, kind of a friend caretaker, as opposed to not really, I didn't have to take care of my family. I didn't have to take care of my parents or anyone else in that sense at my own. It was mainly in a social context.
Okay, all right. That's an important insight as well. A second characteristic that many of my patients have is that they tend to push their own emotions away or down or repress them, different ways to express it. But they're particularly the negative emotions, anger, fear, shame, grief, guilt, are emotions that can get pushed to the background, even to the point of rarely being felt, let's put it that way. And when you do that, you kind of lose an essential signal about your interactions with the world. Would you say that you had that issue?
Yeah, I would say I was definitely a emotionally repressed person, at least to some extent. I felt at times as though I could wear my positivity on my sleeve, and I have the potential to be a deeply passionate, positive person and also a deeply passionate, negative person. And I definitely withheld a lot of the negativity from other people. I didn't feel, and probably other people to some extent feel this way, that I grew up in a house where we just didn't really talk too much about the emotional aspects of life. It wasn't that I felt I couldn't talk about any of those things, but it wasn't deeply discussed. Are you okay? Are you feeling this way? And oftentimes, I guess, even if those questions were asked, that I think I might have just projected that things were fine, even if they weren't. And maybe that goes back to your point about trying to make other people feel better, because I didn't want to worry my parents. I didn't want to inconvenience them, even though they probably did ask me at points. I don't really remember it, in part because it either wasn't there for me, or if it was, I didn't take advantage of it because I didn't want to inconvenience. And I think for me, reading Dr. Sarno's literature, understanding the repressed anger in particular, that one resonated with me a lot, because I withhold a lot of negative energy, a lot of it directed towards myself. As I learned from doing internal family systems work, I have a critical part of myself that really was particularly strong and was formed at a point when I felt as though I wasn't getting the grades good enough that were going to be good enough to set myself up in life for success, and also just get validation from my parents, because they were incredibly smart, incredibly intellectual, and successful in their careers. And so when my grades were slipping and I wasn't doing as well, that critical part of myself forms at a point to say, Alex, you need to get your life together. You need to, and I'm saying that in kind words. It wasn't that nice. There were a lot of expletives in there too. And I think that deep negativity towards myself really was like, I repressed the hell out of it.
Yeah. No, this is This is remarkably insightful, Alex, and I appreciate your sharing all of this with us very much, because for most of my patients, particularly those who've had symptoms for longer than a year, it is possible to trace the roots of their condition back to their childhood experience. Very often, the common denominator is being made to feel like you're not measuring up, being made to feel like you're a second-rate human being, that you're not good enough, or that in more extreme cases that you're worthless. And you definitely experienced that yourself, that your self-esteem was knocked down to a significant degree. Can you recall particular experiences that could have resulted in that? That what I find in many people is that the self-esteem issue is the most fundamental, and that a lot of the other things, the people-pleasing and the excessive self-criticism, flow out of that. But if we can understand the roots of where this came from, it facilitates making changes.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the kind of environment that I was in growing up, I would actually go back a little bit and to understand the house that my mom grew up in. Her parents, both immigrants, my grandfather from Iran and my grandmother from Poland, there's kind of two things to me that I think inform a lot of this. And this is in no way blaming or casting shame, or, I love all of my family and we have great relationships.
Yeah, we do not bash parents on this podcast, because we know that they were doing their best, even though there may have been significant struggles.
Exactly. So understanding two things. First of all, that my grandparents were both products of childhood trauma, uppercase T. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She and her parents were both, or the three of them were Schindler's List survivors. They made it, they spent the entirety of the Holocaust going from the ghetto to labor camps to Auschwitz to Schindler's camp where they were liberated. My grandma never processed her trauma until the film came out in 1993, when she felt as though there was some sort of visual aid that could help people understand, well, it was worse than the movie depicts, but it's close. And then for my grandfather, he grew up in Iran and had a abusive father. And so each of them left their home countries with a lot of baggage. And I think growing up, I don't think my mom ever experienced any sort of abuse, or certainly like to that extent. But I think the combination of both the immigrant mentality of our kids need to be successful at all costs, plus this sort of unprocessed trauma, I think does have a tremendous impact. And I think that just epigenetic stress transfers from generation to generation. And the last point I was going to make was just the idea, and I've spoken about this with my mom, and I appreciated the insight too, was growing up, it felt as though her parents didn't ask her about how she was doing. It was what she's doing. And I think to a lesser extent, because my parents did check in on me and did ask me how I was doing, but it did feel growing up that my household was quite achievement and accomplishment driven compared to happiness at all costs. And of course, my parents wanted me to be happy, and this is not an indictment, but I think just naturally you adopt certain tenets and principles from your parents, even if you don't like the ways in which you grew up or that your parents parented you. And I think in our household, I always perceived intellect and drive and achievement as paramount. And I think that's what justified being horrible to myself in order for me to succeed, because success in that external sense was the goal. Therefore, achieve that at all costs, even if it comes at the expense of chipping away at my inner psyche. And that eventually the knock-on effect is that I think people have a hard time understanding as they get into this mind-body world. Well, but I was on a boat, and I did too. I was on a boat. What does the boat have anything to do with all of these things? No, it's just you were a frog in boiling water, and the frog is getting heated, and it doesn't know that it's getting boiled alive.
Water whose temperature is slowly being ramped up so that you don't notice it. And a lot of my patients came from environments where achievement was emphasized, but there seemed to be no limit to the level of achievement that needed to be accomplished. in order to get the support and the love and the affirmation that no matter how hard you tried and no matter how much you achieved, there always seemed to be another bar to jump over that was just a little bit higher.
Yes.
Did you experience that?
I experienced it at times. I think my parents did, again, the best that they could. And at times,
Yes.
I felt as though I was combined. My parents went to Yale, Columbia, Cornell, Stanford, and Princeton. So when you grow up in a household with that much intellect and that much grad school experience, I felt tremendous pressure to live up to that. I think at the point when I felt my grades were not going to be good enough to get into a school like that, my parents were very clear, very adamant that it didn't matter and that I should just go where I want to go. So that I need to preface as being the case. I still felt in a lot of contexts of my life, being the best that I could be was, again, so important. And I think that should be a lesson that people take away. But I felt deeply overwhelmed I started to feel that overwhelm in middle school when school got really hard all of a sudden. And then
Overwhelmed starting in middle school. That's early.
Yeah. Well, I went to a private school in DC, and these schools are kind of feeders and kind of prep schools in a sense for getting these parents what they want in their kids getting into a good school. So this school started to get overwhelming by 7th grade. And then by high school, I had at least gotten over a lot of these social barriers that I had felt that in middle school, coupled with the academic rigor. But the academic rigor in high school was just, it reached a point where I was, taking several AP classes, but even by comparison, I wasn't taking that many. And I was practicing piano an hour and a half to 2 hours a day because that was my joy in life. And I was playing soccer and I was doing all these other things. And by junior year, I'm sleeping 5-6 hours a night. And that's just so unhealthy. And I think in hindsight, it's not necessarily anything I could do. I try not to live my life with too much regret. But I think that the pressure cooker had started at that point. And by the time I reached college, I was burnt out.
Were you having any neuroplastic symptoms during those years?
I think the one that I can look back on and maybe see as being one was just headaches. I don't think they were migraines per se, but I think I did kind of always have very often enough that my parents would say like, oh, you're having a lot of headaches. Are you okay? And that's the one that comes to mind. None other that I can really think of that I've experienced on this mind-body path that I've been on the last few years. But that's the one that comes to mind.
Okay. All right. So a couple more questions come to mind around the time that your dizziness symptoms began. Were you living a fairly intense lifestyle at that time with respect to work or anything else?
I would say the direct correlation, again, a lot of people who experience mind-body symptoms will have something that leads into it or some catalyst moment. For me, that was being a musician and being on tour for 2 months in a row. So usually when I would tour, certainly up to that point, a month was about the most that I would do in a row. Just by happenstance of the people that I was collaborating with, that was how long we'd have shows. In this case, I was supposed to have a tour that was in January of that year, 2022, and one that was during the summer. And then because of COVID scare in Europe, it actually got moved to later. So the tours actually, I had a 2-day gap in between, a month and then a month. First one, a month across North America. Also, keep in mind, and I didn't mention this before, but in May, early May, on the first tour that I went on, I got COVID. And that was a very stressful experience. Because
in the middle of the tour?
Yes, yeah. The artist that I was playing with, he and I both got COVID, and we were opening for another artist. So we felt both stress and kind of letting other people down because the shows went on as normal, but we weren't a part of it. And the rest of our team, the other musicians, tour manager, everyone else was fine, which I'm glad that they were okay. But we definitely had 5 days of just feeling like outcasts. And even when we came back and we were testing negative and we were fine, I think people kind of were wary and we felt sort of like human petri dishes at times because people were concerned and scared, which is fair. But, these are the human costs of illness.
Yeah,
In this
understandable.
case, a true physical illness that has a understandable root cause and eventually subsides. So yeah, you take that into account. I did probably 40 shows in 60 days. So it was a lot, and the second tour was half in the United States, half in Europe. So there's just a lot of moving around. And at that time, sleep was not an issue for me. It since has become my second underlying symptom behind dizziness as far as mind-body symptoms that I experience on a regular basis. But at that time, I could sleep anywhere, anytime. But when you're on the road, it's still scarce because it's just
40 shows in 60 days.
Yeah.
Hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Another area of interest that I want to ask about is the relationship with your then girlfriend, now wife. That can sometimes play a role in people's symptoms. And there are two ways that can happen. One of them is that many of my patients form relationships with people that are unbalanced. They have grown up living in a way that they are always focused on the needs of others, and they end up choosing for their close relationship partners people who have a lot of needs or a lot of problems or a lot of issues. And so they carry on with that approach to their close personal relationships of being supportive and helpful and focused on the needs of and solving their problems, and the relationships end up being unbalanced. And that can be a source of stress that can contribute to symptoms. The other way that a close personal relationship can actually be triggering for symptoms is if the relationship is the opposite of that, where it's mutually supportive and it is balanced, and whatever you are giving to the partner, they are giving back to you, and that it's obviously a much healthier situation. And that relationship for many of my patients is the first time that they've had such a balance, that someone has cared for them so much. And that's obviously a good thing, but it can generate anxiety about whether a relationship like that is going to last, especially if you've never had one like that before. So at least for the short term, early in those relationships, especially when they get close, there can be anxiety over the longevity of it. The second thing is that the more you accept that you actually are the kind of person that your partner is telling you are, that tends to counteract the low self-esteem that a person has carried from the past. And the more you accept that you're actually a fairly decent human being, the more it informs you that the way you were treated in the past was not necessarily deserved. And that can stir up a certain amount of resentment about what you had to go through, the pressures that you were put under, because here you are with somebody who's not putting you under those kind of pressures, which makes it clear that you didn't deserve those kinds of pressures, and those negative emotions that you repressed as a younger person can come knocking on the door in the form of symptoms. So that's kind of a long-winded question, but can you relate to any of that?
I could relate much more to the latter.
Okay,
I can
good.
say that I definitely feel my relationship with my wife is tremendous, and she loves me so much. I love her so much, and I think that we've always had a great rapport in terms of being able to support each other's needs as best as we can. I think prior to the symptoms, we had been going through one of our first big rough patches, probably the biggest up to that point. We had started seeing a couples therapist only once, maybe twice. And so things were not their best. And I think when we went, she actually was on tour with me for the second tour, and we were touring through Europe, and on paper we're having the dream, right? We're both being musicians, we're both being creative and getting paid for it, and touring through Europe and seeing beautiful cities. But beneath the surface, we weren't doing as well as we normally would. And that was because communication had reached a lapse in terms of us being able to deliver on what we wanted. And I think that was when we first started to understand really deeply, like, the love languages aspect of our relationship, where she could match my needs and I could match hers. And yeah, I think that although my relationship in its totality I would view as wholly positive, at that time leading into the symptom onset, it was among, if not the greatest source of stress in our relationship that we had had. Not that it was the greatest source of stress to me in my life, but just that as far as our relationship in its health was not at its healthiest. And so that could have played a part as well, even though I feel in general my relationship with my wife is amazing.
So when the symptoms began, can you think of anything that stands out as a particular trigger now that you're able to look back? Or do you think it was perhaps just an accumulation?
I think it was an accumulation of things. I think that COVID was particularly stressful on me in my career because as a touring musician, that was probably my greatest revenue stream at that time. Although I did other musical things, that was what I did a lot of. I had a lot going on in 2020, and I was scheduled to do a lot of big things. And I was going to go on some really the biggest tours I'd ever done. And then they all got canceled. And when that started, or rather when COVID started and all of my opportunities that I was going to have dried up, I definitely experienced some career stress. That was, in general, I have some level of career stress working in a field that is inherently freelance, and I sort of make the opportunities that come my way and that I create out of thin air. And when all of it dried up during COVID, there was certainly some level of stress that I had experienced during that time, aside from just, geopolitical, psychosocial stress. There's a deep amount of insecurity and uncertainty going on in the world. And so you add that to feeling uncertain just in my own life. And I think those things probably were part of the accumulation of what ultimately led to the onset of the symptoms. I think I really felt on paper, maybe because I was not a well self-examined person at that time, that I felt like my life was generally good leading into it. I think when the symptoms started and my life just became a shell of itself, I realized just how many toxic behaviors that I was indulging in. And I think one thing that I forgot to mention in terms of the type of person who deals with these symptoms is someone who catastrophizes.
Mm-hmm.
I was on tour, as I said, during the first of these month-long tours. I had a symptom in my finger, and I have a benign tumor in my finger. It's non-cancerous, or rather it's non-malignant, but it is like a growth on the side of my finger. As a pianist for my job, that's obviously somewhat of a concern. And I, for whatever reason, on one day on this tour, I am just in really agonizing pain in my finger. And as soon as this happens, the day before I was fine, the day after I was fine, but that day, we're driving through Sedona, Flagstaff, Arizona area. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I was just having this conversation in my head about, okay, what is my career going to be after I have to quit the piano? That's just where my head goes, is worst case scenario immediately. And that is sort of a deep trait of mine that I used to have, which was prepping for doomsday, prepping for worst case in case things went wrong, rather than just being present in the moment, observing how life is. And when things get bad, then react and be proactive to the bad rather than being just bracing for impact, which I kind of spent a lot of my life doing the latter in that case.
Yeah, and I think many of our viewers are going to relate to that very strongly. So I know you've had significant improvement in your symptoms at the present. What changes do you feel you've made that have led to that?
I think number one, starting to do, I had been doing talk therapy, just general talk therapy for about a year and a half leading up to when I started to switch my modalities. The treatments that I felt helped me a lot, certainly, were EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, essentially doing the eye scanning while talking about a traumatic event. Again, in my case, even lowercase t trauma can be something that you can work on and resolve. And in fact, for some people, EMDR, I know for capital T trauma, it can be too difficult to revisit even for those people that this modality is designed for. So even if you're someone who thinks, I haven't been traumatized in that way, like my grandma being in the Holocaust, you don't have to have been in the Holocaust to have experienced things that were the worst in your life. It's all relative.
Yeah, that
So,
took
yeah.
me a long time to learn that as a clinician, that the traumas that we don't give a capital T to can be every bit as impactful for a person as the ones that are more obvious. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. I think doing IFS work was helpful in terms of at least understanding the layout of how my brain works and the parts of myself that have formed over time. I think really at the critical self, understanding that part of myself that formed at a time when I needed to get my life together and I perceived getting my life together, and then being and I mean, for lack of a better word, just an asshole to myself all the time. Was understanding that was super, it was a relief, even though I was upset that that was the way that it was. I think also the parts, I guess also I was seeing a pain reprocessing therapist as well. So specifically someone, she was at the Better Mind Center. Now she's just independent, Lauren. And my EMDR therapist was Alex Bailey. Her name's Lauren Garshaw. Both very wonderful therapists, helped me so much on my journey. And with her, a lot of our work was just centered around not fearing the sensations, which for anyone who's gone on that journey, way easier said than done.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I had grown to, every time that I experienced the sensation of instability, the feeling that my foot was moving up and down, or that I was stepping through the floor, or that I was feeling like the bobbing and rocking and swaying, immediate knee-jerk reaction is just expletive every time. Just, I can't believe this is happening. I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. And pushing it away. And now that I understand that part of the way to through this is to just accept. It's quite a Buddhist notion of being able to view a sensation, good or bad, as just the sensation itself.
And that it can be a form of communication, that your mind is trying to express distress and that it's trying to let you know that it's got something it's not happy about, and you can use it as a form of communication.
Correct. I think once I was able to allow life to be as it was, things started to get better. And of course, on the way, I experienced setbacks all the time. I think the recovery, as Dr. Yo would say, like the recovery is the dips. Like there's no recovery without the dips, because what you do is that you tighten that window of grieving. When you experience a setback, when you experience symptom increase as you're improving, the only way through is just to tighten that window of sadness, anger, because every time that I experience setbacks, and I experience setbacks to this day, I mean, even last week, and I can talk about that too, my symptoms will spike. And the first knee-jerk reaction is anger. I can't believe this is happening. And then I get sad, and then I'm grieving, and then eventually I accept it. And the goal in recovery is just taking that window from being a week of grieving to ideally grieving as little as you can, because you understand at its core nothing's wrong. Your body is sending you a signal because it's perceiving danger, perceiving some sort of imbalance in your life, and then you can treat it with understanding and compassion and say that things will be okay eventually.
Yeah, that's such an important insight. I have many of my patients look back at the traumas they went through, whether you give them a capital T or not, and imagine a child they care about going through those same experiences while you are just observing that happening. And that helps a lot of people develop some kindness toward themselves when they can see not themselves in that environment, but a child that they care about, and watch them try to cope with those same experiences. It can give you a much more positive sense of yourself. Another analogy that I use is to think of your early years as having been parachuted into a dangerous jungle or into the Himalayas, and having to find your way out. And to give yourself tremendous credit for having accomplished that, so that you can more readily generate kindness for yourself instead of being an asshole to yourself, as would otherwise be the natural response. And And the kinder you can be to yourself, then the more you're able to look at the physical symptoms as just a side effect of how much you had to go through, as well as being a signal that there is something happening in your life right now that your mind wants you to pay attention to. And that also can help accelerate the stages of grief that you went through when those symptoms flare back up again.
Absolutely. I think one thing that you just, in your description of all that it reminded me of was a really valuable lesson on this journey that I took from my cognitive behavioral therapist for insomnia specifically. So, a few weeks after the onset of the dizziness symptoms, I started to experience tremendous insomnia. I didn't sleep for 2 days in a row. And, being awake for over 48 hours is like just an ongoing nightmare. And I worked through, in those bad days, I was taking like full dose of Ambien and still sleeping 2 hours a night. Like that was how in fight or flight my system was at that time. And it's something that's like a lot better now. I still deal with ad hoc and is annoying, but it is what it is. One lesson that I took from my therapist that I really appreciated in hindsight was that at some point, I was being miserable and just talking about how shitty my life was. And he asked if he could be critical for a second. And I said, okay. I mean, it's like, that's not necessarily what I want when I'm not doing well, but okay. And he said, you're kind of inhabiting the victim role right now. And I was like, really? Like, in what way? And he said, well, instead of viewing yourself as someone who is strong and courageous in the face of adversity, you're viewing yourself as just my life sucks. And I don't think that mindset is going to help you. If you can view yourself as someone who is the knight in shining armor standing before the dragon that's trying to kill them, and he was using that as a metaphor, not saying that the insomnia is trying to kill me, but I think it was valuable. Because I think I was really stuck viewing myself as just like this poor, woeful person who has no hope and no potential for getting my life back. And I think it was super helpful to get the insight that I should just view myself as someone who's really doing their best in a really chaotic, terrible situation.
Yeah, I mean, even more than that, I mean, I emphasize to my patients that when they were coming through their early life experiences, that they were showing me and showing themselves a tremendous level of perseverance, a heroic level of perseverance. And they should view themselves in those terms. They were parachuted into these very challenging environments through no fault of their own, and they deserve to give themselves tremendous credit for having made it through those experiences. And when you can look at yourself in those terms, then you are flipping your self-esteem 180 degrees from exceedingly negative into deservedly positive.
Yep. I think that along the way, if you embody the idea that you are putting in, and it's cliche, but trusting the process of your recovery when it comes to, if you're putting yourself in a position to succeed. For me, the one habit that I reintroduced into my life that made the biggest impact on just general baseline anxiety levels was meditation. And I had meditated for large stretches of my life outside of college. After my first job out of college that I got let go from, I was pretty empty as a person. I thought, what am I doing with my life? And I started meditating on a near regular basis. And then for some reason, leading up to that period of stressful time, it had gotten out of my routine. And then after the symptoms onset, I didn't feel comfortable meditating physically, because when I would close my eyes, I would feel like someone was shaking me. And so I didn't meditate for a while. And then, something that I desperately needed, but I didn't feel physically comfortable to do. And then eventually I feel comfortable enough to do it, and I start meditating every day. And my baseline level of anxiety was just down so much.
Yeah.
Does that mean that it goes away? No. What happens is that I have a better appreciation and understanding for when things come up, that I observe the thought. I see I am experiencing dizziness. I am experiencing instability. I am experiencing sleeplessness. I'm observing those sensations or those thoughts, or I'm observing the thought that I might sleep terribly tonight. Those thoughts used to paralyze me and keep me stuck in not being able to live my life. And yeah, do I have those moments still? Yes, but I'm able to observe it, and it's given me the ability to just live more presently. And again, the process is more important, because if I'm doing these things that I know take care of myself and recalibrate my nervous system, that, for example, the result of instability or the result of poor sleep is bad, it's more important to observe that, well, in totality, if you want to look at it from a grade standpoint, if I'm sleeping well 95% of days, it's still an A, and it's still great. And even if you're not, it doesn't matter that you're doing the habits that you have heard from people like me, clinicians like you, and anyone who's understanding of this world, that if you're doing and taking steps in the right direction, again, treat it like a B student, a C student. Don't focus your entire life on your recovery. But if you're doing things on a regular basis that help your nervous system, help you as a person, that is more important than observing, oh, well, I felt unstable today, or I felt back pain today.
Yeah, kindness towards yourself is so fundamentally important. Well, Alex, this has been tremendously insightful. I know that everyone who watches this is going to be very grateful for the insights you've provided. Are there any questions that you have for me before we close?
I guess to you, when it comes to the way in which this mind-body space has developed and evolved, as someone who went through this whole experience myself, you asked me yourself, did anyone ask you if this was a mind-body condition? And the answer was no. What is your perception of how mind-body medicine is being integrated into the modern medical system? And what are ways in which, because I'm starting to coach people with mind-body symptoms as well, specifically in dizziness, but in broader terms in general.
Yeah.
And I am deeply passionate about finding ways in which we can find a better balance because I think modern medicine is so deeply important and has its place in most issues. But when it comes to conditions like mine and the ones that you treat, it doesn't work. So
yeah,
how do we find that balance?
We're making tremendous progress. We have people who support the ATNS as members, and because of that support, we're able to reach out through numerous channels to educate the public and the healthcare profession. And the first goal that we have is for everyone, whether they're a medical professional or not, to understand that the brain is powerful and can create pain or illness anywhere in the body and often in multiple locations. And once people understand that this is a whole other category of illness, independent of organ disease and structural damage, everything flows from that, because you have to ask the next question, how do we diagnose this? And then the next question, how do we treat this? And, I'm already teaching in medical schools and graduate schools and residency programs in front of the public all over North America and Europe. The change that I've seen in the last 15 years in terms of public and professional acceptance has just been extraordinary. And it's not going to stop. It's going to keep going. So I'm looking forward to the day within hopefully the end of this decade that everyone will understand this concept and it'll be routine. We're not there yet. We still need more members to support us so that we can continue to educate everyone, but we are on a tremendous progressive path.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us today. Much appreciated.
Of course. Thanks for having me.